Do you want a better blanket? Here.
All right, everyone, it's 9:30 and I'm just going to give folks another minute to enter and then we'll get going. All right, we're going to get things started. So everyone, welcome to the second installment of our hemp webinar series. We are having weekly webinars for the hemp program once a week. The first one was last Wednesday. It went over the hemp program as it stands and as it stood. I should probably mention I am Tricia Ehrlich, the hemp program manager. And this week we will be focusing on the organics program. And we will also be focusing on pesticide regulations and compliance. So this is, again, the second of our hemp webinar series. Just some logistical components. We are recording right now. I have everyone on mute by design so that we don't have too much background noise. This recording will be made available afterwards. It just might take a little bit before we can get it up to the site because we provide closed captioning for all of our recordings. If you have questions, please type them into the chat box. So we will be accepting questions, but we'll be moderating those questions through the chat box. So our first presenter today is Brenda Book. Brenda Book is the program manager for our organics program here at the Washington State Department of Agriculture. And I am going to turn it over to Brenda. And if you have questions specifically for Brenda on pesticides, please be sure to put them into the chat box, and then I will ask them to Brenda once her presentation is finished. Just so you know, our plan is to answer as many questions as we can, but there are two things. One, we have a limitation on time, and two, we just don't always have the answers to everything right away. So if you have a question, we will do our best to answer it today, but if we can't, we'll just get back to you later via email. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Brenda. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a quick little test. You can hear me? Yes? Yeah, Tricia?
Yes.
Awesome. Wonderful.
I can hear you.
Well, it's really great to be here with you all this morning here in my office. I don't usually get to hold presentations in such a setting, but I'm glad that we can make this work and get some information out to folks. I'm going to give like Tricia said, my name is Brenda Book. I'm the program manager for WSDA's Organic Certification Program. I've been with the program for almost 20 years, and our program has been in existence for almost 35 years now. I'm going to give you guys a brief overview about the services that we provide and resources that we have available. But we're not going to cover everything. I'm sure there's going to be some additional questions that you have, and my main message that I want to get out there is how to find us, how to reach us, and how to follow up to ask those additional questions. Let's see. All right. Just a little bit about us to get started. WSDA Organic Program, we have three core functions. We are Washington's only USDA accredited organic certification agency. And we provide access to the organic market through our certification services. We're also the only certification agency that's recognized by USDA as an input material review organization. And that means that we register input materials, we evaluate them for compliance with the USDA organic regulation, and we publish a public list for anybody to access to find input materials that are they can use in compliance with that federal regulation. And then last, we're also a resource center for producers, handlers, and consumers on organic standards and requirements. We take great pride in this last stool of our three-legged stool. We have a library of resources available, not just for farms and businesses that are interested in certification, but for the public as well, so that they have an understanding of what that organic label means and what the standards are that back that up. Let's see, just a little bit about our history. We are the oldest and largest state-run certification agency in the country. In Washington State, we first put a law in place regulating the term organic back in 1985, well before the federal regulation came out in 2002. Our services are funded solely through certification fees. We don't receive any tax dollars. So the fees that we charge for the services we provide, that's what keeps us here and keeps us able to provide those services. We do lean on grant funds so that we can support outreach and education activities beyond just the core certification services. And then we also administer the National Organic Certification Cost Share Program in Washington State. We're really proud of this. It's a federal program that provides a reimbursement for annual certification fees back to qualifying businesses. Last year, we dispersed about $800,000 back to certified operations. And this year, we're continuing to get as many fees back to folks that the federal funding allows for. This slide gives you a little bit of a snapshot of the growth in organic over the years. It starts back, not in 1985 when we had that first state program, but we're starting our clock on this one in 2002 when the USDA federal organic regulation came into play, which superseded any of those state requirements that we had up to that point. And then you'll see where we were in 2012, 10 years into that federal regulation, and then where we're at today with our certification services. We want to point out, though, that where we see the biggest growth is not always in just the number of farms, but in the expansion of existing farms. We find that operations, will often test the organic market with just a few crops, few fields, and then once they see the benefits of that, then they'll keep on adding year to year. And so 20 to 30% of our existing operations typically submit new land for certification. We also, and that new land is, we call those sites. We currently certify 2,700 distinct sites or fields in Washington state that are producing organic crops. We also certify over 9,000 different products that are packaged with that organic claim on them. And then a couple stats on our input material review side of our work. We're working with 376 different companies right now, and we have over 1,000 products registered on our list that we've done the analysis and we've determined that they are allowed for use in organic production. So before we get into a lot of details about what the standards are and what the requirements are for applying for certification, I want to set the stage here of how industrial hemp came to be an allowed crop that we could start certifying. Up until August of 2016, industrial hemp, did not qualify for organic certification. But in August of 2016, USDA National Organic Program, they put out a notice that allowed industrial hemp to be certified according to those federal standards, provided that producer was part of a hemp research pilot program. In November of 2019, that instruction was updated to allow hemp produced in accordance with the U.S. Domestic Hemp Production Program and or the 2014 Farm Bill to apply for organic certification. So it opened the doors up. You didn't have to be part of that, specifically part of that research pilot program. And essentially, hemp is considered the same as any other crop that we offer certification for. So here's just to get that clearly out there as a Q&A format. Can industrial hemp crop be certified by WSDA Organic Program? Yes, and the addition and the evaluation of that crop will go through the same application process and evaluation as any other commercial crop. New farms would submit a new application, and existing farms can submit new site applications if they want to add on industrial hemp to their crop list. Same goes for handled and processed industrial hemp products. In general, we can include them within the scope of the services that we provide. New operations submitting a new handler or processor application packet. And existing operations can add that product line. We do have a couple stipulations, though, in the handled and processed arena. If a new operation or an existing operation would like to add a new product that includes CBD as an ingredient, and that new product is a food product, which by definition includes alcohol, supplements, and pet food, we're unable to offer organic certification at this time because of some restrictions that are put in place with State Bill 5276 on the use of CBD in products. But if the formulation has CBD as an ingredient and it's for a non-food product, and again, that includes alcohol, supplements, and pet food, then we are able to offer certification. So examples are CBD hemp cigarettes, personal care products, or distillates. So why would an industrial hemp product want to get certified? We like to point out three main benefits of certification. We meaning USDA as well as WSDA Organic Program. Market access is probably the biggest factor. Certification sets products apart and communicates a defined production standard to consumers. The organic regulation is a federal regulation, so it's federally defined, and it has one definition regardless of what state you farm in or that product is sold in. Organic certification also allows farmers to be counted. When we look at different resources that are made available or what kind of support or technical assistance is needed for certified organic farms and businesses. They're looking at how many stakeholders we have, and they're counting that based on certified operations. And then getting support. There's a lot of federal programs in place right now where if you are in the process of certification or you've achieved certification, it opens the door to financial assistance and conservation tools, specifically the Natural Resource Conservation Service and USDA have some great partnerships in making sure that there's some extra support systems in place for certified operations. So I have this one slide that is a super brief snapshot of a very large regulation. These are just a few of the high points in that regulation, and we don't have time today to go into all of the details of what the standards are. And so I want to highlight this little summary, and then we'll talk about some specific parts of the standard that are listed here. But first, no GMO sewage sludge or irradiation. It's a standard across the board. They're called the Big Three, and they're explicitly called out within the organic standards as not being allowed in organic production. Organic standards also require practices to prevent pests, weeds, and disease. Prevention before the use of inputs is required within the regulation. And then when the an input is necessary, it has to be an input that minimizes its impact to the environment. And that's where we go through that process of reviewing materials to determine which inputs meet that criteria and which do not. Organic operations are also required to improve or enhance soil quality through crop rotation and fertility management. Again, coming back to looking at the whole system and preventing issues and building systems instead of using an input. Organic certification also requires the use of organic seeds, and for this audience I should have stuck in there and annual seedlings. That's what my slide in a minute focuses in on. And there's a requirement to promote biodiversity and natural resource conservation. So before we get into some of the details of what those standards are, I want to highlight our resources that we have on our website. You'll see in these slides that I go through that I'm making a note of where we have a fact sheet or some sort of other resource that gets into more details than what I'm going to be providing to you today. But first, you got to know where that website is at and where you go. So we have information online. Specifically, we have a page for new applicants that leads you to a resource page, or you can go directly to that resource page. And then we have another page that includes forms and applications. And again, all of them linked together. And if you get to one of them, you'll be able to get to the rest of them. But I encourage you to check that out, especially if you have any specific questions on any of the things I'm going to highlight today. So I'm going to start here with pest, weed, and disease control. So like I mentioned in a couple slides ago, it's preventative practices first. And it's specifically a three-tiered approach that organic farms need to take. Step one is that prevention. Prevention specifically through crop rotation, soil management practices, sanitation, and cultural practices. If those practices and steps do not work, you still need some more intervention here in preventing pest, weed, and diseases. Mechanical or physical methods can be used. And it's only at that final step 3 where there's an application of an input. And we evaluate, what steps were put in place prior to choosing an input. But when an input is needed, it has to be an approved synthetic or a natural material. And we'll get into that in one moment. And here, highlight, we've got a fact sheet that talks about preventative practices. We also have a video that talks about preventative practices. a video that features Washington farms and peer-to-peer information on how you can implement preventative practices on your farm. So how do you determine what is an allowed and a prohibited input? And I'm focusing in on just crops in this conversation. As I mentioned before, GMOs not allowed, explicitly stated in the organic regulation. So if there's GMOs involved in the production of that input, then we know right away then that's not an allowed input. What is allowed would be a natural substance. This is a general rule that can be followed. If it's natural, it's allowed. But we have to look at exactly what's in that product. There may be an active ingredient that's a natural ingredient, but there's also inactive ingredients that we need to evaluate. But if it can be verified that this is a completely natural substance, it's going to be allowed in organic production. Then your other general rule to keep in mind is that if it's synthetic, it's prohibited. Natural allowed, synthetic prohibited. But of course, this is a regulation, and so there always are some exceptions to that basic rule. Section 205-601 of the National Organic Standards outlines those exceptions. And so it has a list of the synthetics that have been deemed as following the criteria laid out in the regulation for allowed inputs. And they've been deemed approved for use in organic production. But it's a set list. These are the only synthetics that can be used. We have a little fact sheet on input materials for use in organic production, just to highlight that there. And has a little bit of a dichotomous key that you can follow along with. So in addition to our fact sheet, you also can go to our website to find information about allowed inputs. This is a snapshot from our website. So we have 3 different lists that we direct you to. WSDA organic program, and the Organic Material Review Institute, also known out there as OMRI, and the California Department of Food and Agriculture. We all publish lists of materials that have been reviewed and approved for use in organic production. WSDA Organic Certification accepts all of these different inputs if a producer is using them. So it doesn't have to be on the Washington State list. But we also want to point out these are not exhaustive lists. These are companies that have chosen to be registered and to have their product evaluated so that they can be listed on that public list of approved inputs. There are other inputs out there that still can comply, and we do that review on an individual case-by-case basis. And so, you can always contact us and we'll talk you through what the next steps are. I want to focus in on organic seeds and annual seedlings for a second. Organic seeds are required in the regulation. However, if an organic seed cannot be found in the quality, quantity, or form, which equates to variety, an untreated, non-GMO, conventionally produced seed may be used. So there is an exception provided a search has taken place and you are unable to find an organic version of that seed. There is not an exception for annual seedlings in the regulation. Organic seedlings must be certified organic. We have another fact sheet. And again, a dichotomous key to walk you through the decision-making steps to determine, if what you would like to do would meet the requirements. Crop rotation standard is a really important part of the regulation, and it's a little deceiving because it's titled crop rotation standard, but it's much more than just rotating crops. What this standard does is it outlines the practices that a crop rotation plan must accomplish. So through crop rotation practices, through the use of sod, cover crops, green manure crops, catch crops, the practices must maintain or improve soil quality and organic matter content, must manage crop nutrients and soil fertility, must prevent crop pests, weeds, and diseases, and must provide erosion control. And so we're going to be evaluating if the practices that an operation is choosing to implement for their crop rotation um, standard meets these requirements. Again, another fact sheet that we have on our website regarding this important standard. And natural resources and biodiversity falls, right in place with that crop rotation standard. But it's explicitly written out in the regulation that producers are expected to maintain or improve the natural resources of an operation, including soil and water quality. And so we're going to be looking at, the practices that are being selected and implemented and evaluating if they are doing that. Yeah, well, want to highlight we have two fact sheets that get into both, kind of touching on both of these topics, and I encourage everybody to check that out because this is a pretty big topic here, and there's a lot of different ways that an operation can meet those requirements. And this is not always the most fun part of the standard for farmers because this is the office side of it. And it's so important, though. It's so important that it's worth mentioning and kind of getting into the weeds here for a second on what those record keeping requirements are. Because organic certification requires inspections, but we're only there as a minimum once a year. We depend on your record keeping system to tell us the story of what you've been doing throughout the year. You must have a record keeping system that one, it works for your operation. It makes sense for the type of production that you're doing, but it must fully disclose all your activities. And it must be in sufficient detail to be readily understood during an inspection. So it can't just make sense to you. It has to make sense for anybody looking at your records. Your records must also be maintained for 5 years and be sufficient to demonstrate compliance with the regulation. We have a great video on the record keeping requirements, and we also have a fact sheet that provides example types of records that would meet these different requirements. But here in just a quick visual, it's how we like to encourage folks to think about their record keeping system. And if you can answer the question that does your each record link together, and are you able to go one step forward and one step back, then you would be able to meet those requirements. And when I say link and going one step forward and one step back, that means your records have to talk to each other. And so you have to have a system in place where if we started with the buyer, your customer of an organic product, and looked at your records for providing them that product, from there, we would be able to trace that product all the way back through the production to the source of the seed from the very beginning. And that means, again, all your activities must have a record that outlines those activities and must be able to link together. So you have to, we're looking at lot numbers, and we're looking at how do we production codes, and how do we make sure we're talking about the same product and the same process. One quick snapshot about the 5 steps to organic certification. I'm not going to get into all of those steps. We have a fantastic video, again, another resource available for you on those 5 steps. But to the big point that I want to make here is that this is an annual process. And so it doesn't stop with just the first year. Every year we're going through this same evaluation, and we're evaluating how are you continuing to improve your system and how are you monitoring the effectiveness of your practices. But I do want to focus in on the inspections for a second, just because we always get a lot of questions of what happens on the organic inspection. Because that's when you're coming face to face with our program and have somebody there on site evaluating your practices and available to discuss issues with you. The regulations do allow us to have both announced and unannounced inspections, and that's part of our program. Our inspectors go out and they compare your actual practices and your inputs with the standards. They're going to be collecting information through interviews, observations, records review, and sampling. And specifically with that records review, they're going to conduct audits. They're going to conduct audits to see if all of your records can link back and to verify that you had the production capacity that matches your distribution. But they're also there to provide technical assistance. With the caveat that inspectors, they cannot consult or give advice. And this is a little different than maybe some of the other inspection systems you may be familiar with. We have a really clear line there for the role of our inspector, and it's our certification review staff or specialists that are the counterpart to the inspector. They're the ones that are really there to help guide you and give you information on the organic standards on a more broad sense, where the inspector is just there to do that evaluation. Part of that inspector's evaluation does include pesticide residue testing. The organic standards requires certified agencies to conduct pesticide residue testing on at least 5% of our certified operations. This last year, we tested 15% of our certified operations. Sampling, we do a risk-based assessment for our sampling program, and it may be used in any situation where there's a potential for contamination or commingling. And then the organic regulations lay out criteria for when, if there are positive pesticide residues, if that product can be sold as organic or if it needs to be removed from the organic marketplace. And I want to just flash up here a little added service that I didn't cover at the beginning when I talked about our 3 core services, but it's tied into certification. It's kind of like the certification 101 building block, and that's our transitional certification program. So we do offer a service where you may not qualify for organic certification yet because your land hasn't been free of prohibited materials for 36 months. You're still in that process of adopting organic practices. We offer a program where we'll work with you during that transition. And so we'll have the inspectors come out and they'll be analyzing, where you're at and if you're meeting those federal organic standards. And then from there, you just roll right into the organic certification program. So we've got a fact sheet on that again, and you can check out more information. But I also want to highlight that we, regardless if you're interested in certification or if you just want to find out a little bit more about the standards, we really depend on that public-private partnership. And any concerns that you have about organic practices or potential violations to the standards or claims that are being made, we encourage you to reach out to us. We take all of our complaints very seriously, and we want to work with stakeholders to make sure that they are in compliance and follow up on areas where there may be a misunderstanding of what the regulations are, and we can educate and bring someone into compliance. Or if we need to deal with fraud, potential fraud, and conduct investigations, we really want to hear from you if you do have concerns in the industry. Again, I want to highlight one more time on that website link, especially for folks that might have just joined us. You can find a vast library of information and resources covering the little snapshots I just gave, as well as much more. And then I figured I needed one last slide to just talk about a program that is not quite up and running, but we are in the works, and it ties into the cannabis industry. In May of 2017, Governor Inslee did sign a bill authorizing WSDA to develop a certification service specifically for cannabis or marijuana producers. So not industrial hemp, because industrial hemp, again, starting in 2016, USDA allowed that to be covered in that federal regulation. We conducted some initial rulemaking back in 2017 and 2018, but a lack of funding and capacity has slowed our efforts over the last 24 months. But I just wanted to acknowledge that we still are optimistic about taking on that work and hope to resume that this year. And with that, just want to say thanks for your time, and please do reach out and contact our team if you have any questions about organic certification of your farm or processed or handled products.
All right. Thank you so much, Brenda. That was incredibly informative. As you may have noticed, we have had a ton of people join us in the midst of your presentation. So just to add some clarity for everybody who is now with us. So, oh, and another person coming in from the lobby. Just so everybody knows, we are switching all future webinars to Microsoft Teams. So many of you initially got a WebEx link, and many of you were in that WebEx. And so thank you for following me here to our Microsoft Teams link. We did send out the link to the listserv this week, but it looks like probably a lot of you just had your initial meeting invitations. So just to clarify, since we now have many people in the room, we will not meet in WebEx again. Any WebEx link you have is no good. I will be sending out Microsoft Teams links through our listserv for the next 2 webinars. And worst case scenario, if you don't have, if you aren't on the listserv, if you can't figure out how to get an updated invitation, just send me an email at the email address that I just chatted, and I will make sure that you have the invite to the updated Microsoft Teams meetings. So thank you all so much for coming to join us, and disregard any WebEx invites you may have. So I'm going to just move into questions for Brenda. We have 1 question so far. For anyone with a question on organic or transitional certifications, please be sure to type that into the chat box now so that we can ask Brenda those questions. So our first question is from Gregory Foster with the Cannabis Observer, and he would like to know if you could speak to any differences in achieving organic certification for indoor and greenhouse operations in contrast to traditional outdoor operations.
Sure. Oh, I got an echo. Oh, okay. There essentially are not differences. The standards don't outline one set of requirements for an outdoor and one set for an indoor. One set of standards, and we apply it to your production system. And so if your greenhouse is growing in the ground, and it's just a hoop house covering, land requirements come into play, and we're going to be evaluating that land has been free of prohibited materials for 36 months. If you're growing in a more container-based system, then we're going to be looking at again how your production practices play out. I'm pausing here because at one point we were putting together a fact sheet. Like I'm really pushing those fact sheets today on greenhouse production, but it's still in the works. But so we can stay tuned for that, where we're going to get into a little bit more of those differences. But essentially, the standards are the same. It's just really, we're going to be evaluating, well, what's your particular situation and how are you producing that product, and then we'll apply those standards. So a broad response, because again, all situations are a little bit different. We're going to look at what you're doing and apply that one standard to it.
Are there any other questions for Brenda? Anyone? Okay, well, seeing none, thank you so much, Brenda, for joining us. We really appreciate the presentation. That was a lot of new information for me. And so I really appreciate having you, and we're going to move on to our next presentation. So next we are going to hear from Kelle Davis, Program Manager of the Pesticide Registration Services Division. Kelly's going to provide you with some information on pesticide use on hemp. And if you can, again, just be sure to put any questions that you might have into the chat box, that would be fantastic. All right, thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much. Can everybody see my screen? I have my PowerPoint started.
Yes, looks
okay,
good.
Great, thank you. All right, so I'm going to talk about pesticide use on hemp today. And let me advance to the next slide. Oops, it is not working. Let's go to this one. All right. And I don't show that it's advanced on your end. Let me resume the slideshow. Well, come on now. All right, there we go. So no presentation can happen unless we show off our Hemperor's crown. This is a crown that we take in some of our presentations. We show it off. It's gotten national viewing. We've taken it to some EPA meetings. It's been a big hit. So I always like to show it off. It's kind of a fun little toy that we've got. So a little bit about me, and we're locked up again. Let's try it. All right, a little bit about me. I'm Kelle Davis. I'm the program manager for registration services. We're in the pesticide management division within WSDA. And basically what we do is we register pesticides and fertilizers so that you can purchase them in Washington State. I'm also the cannabis coordinator for WSDA. And in that role, I work with other WSDA programs and some other state agencies with respect to cannabis issues. And when I talk about cannabis in this regard, I'm talking about the high THC cannabis or marijuana. Just a little bit more focus on the marijuana side. Today, though, I'm going to talk about hemp and our hemp list criteria, how we develop that, what we go through when we review a pesticide label for inclusion on the hemp list, and then a little bit about the pesticides that do show up on our hemp list. So we were pretty lucky. We had already developed the criteria and a pesticide list for recreational use marijuana back in 2013 when that was first legalized. And so when hemp started to become more interest in hemp, we already had that criteria developed. So we just used the similar standards to create the criteria and list for hemp. So Developing that criteria was a little bit of a process, and I kind of want to go through it with you. At the time of the Farm Bills, of course, the hemp was not labeled as not a labeled crop on any EPA Section 3 pesticide label. Fast forward to today, there's 57 EPA approved pesticides that have hemp on the label. 56 of them are biopesticides, and one of them is a conventional pesticide. Still, there are no tolerances for pesticide residue on cannabis yet. IR4 is working to develop pesticide residues tolerances on hemp, but nothing yet at this point. So for those of you unfamiliar with IR4, that is the Interregional Research Project. And what they do is they help stakeholders, growers, by getting additional data so that maybe they can use traditional pesticides on their specialty crops. So a lot of registrants, a lot of companies that develop pesticides will do a lot of testing on more popular crops, let's say, like corn or soybean or cotton. But they don't have any pesticide residue data for smaller crops like seed crops or herb crops or spice crops. And so IR4 works to develop data so that those pesticides can also be used on those crops. So back up a little bit, before EPA started approving pesticides for use on hemp in the last couple of years, we already had an established list of over 200 products. So how is that even possible? Well, we know that hemp can be used for a lot of things: food, fiber, oils, medicine. But we decided that unless the pesticide specified on the label as only being allowed for use on hemp grown for fiber, we're going to evaluate that pesticide under the more restrictive criteria for use on a food crop. So a little bit higher bar to achieve. What else do we know about pesticide labels? Well, they have to be applied according to state and federal law. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. Every single Section 3 pesticide label that you see out there is going to have the statement on it that says it is a violation of federal law to use this product in a manner inconsistent with its labeling. So if hemp's not on the label, how do we get away with having a list of products that you can use hemp on? And the trick is, or not the trick, but what we decided was that, is there a way, are we inconsistent with the labeling? How can we be consistent with the labeling? And this is what we came up with. So we know pesticide labels specify the particular crops and sites that they can be applied to, right? And these crops and sites can be expressed very specifically, such as wheat, or more generally, like cereal grains. So a pesticide label that specifies wheat can only be applied to wheat, but a pesticide label that lists cereal grains can be applied to wheat, oats, barley, rye, any other cereal grains out there. So using that logic, knowing that hemp may not necessarily be listed as a crop on the pesticide label, we determined that, again, how that label language reads, pesticides may legally be applied on hemp under certain very general types of crops and sites that are on the label when there is also an exemption from the requirements of a tolerance. And I'm going to talk a little later about what that phrase exemption from the requirement of a tolerance means. Okay, so let's review. Hemp is a food crop not listed on the pesticide label. So the pesticide must be labeled for use on an unspecified food crop or unspecified herbs, which can include like bedding plants, home gardens, or also unspecified oilseed crops. And again, unspecified is interpreted as not prohibiting use on hemp. So trying to be consistent with that pesticide label. We also know there's no tolerances established for hemp. So all the active ingredients must be exempt from the requirements of a tolerance on all food crops. So I'm going to back up to that crazy phrase. What does exempt from the requirements of a tolerance actually mean? Well, the tolerance is the legal limit for a pesticide chemical residue on a food crop. You may also hear it called an MRL, which stands for a maximum residue level. So basically that phrase, exempt from the requirements of a tolerance, it's just a fancy way of saying that there are no maximum pesticide residue levels established for those active ingredients on any raw agricultural commodity, which would include hemp. All right, so now we've got a label in and we've approved it according to Washington state and federal regulations as a pesticide that it's allowed for use in Washington state. But what if it is available to be used on hemp or even marijuana? What are the processes that we go through? So we ask ourselves a couple of questions. And the first question is going to be, are the ingredients tolerance exempt? And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go to the Code of Federal Regulations and we're going to check to see if there is a exemption from tolerance established for that chemical. So in this case, I have azadirachtin. And yeah, it is exempt from the requirements of a tolerance. That's good news. So we know that this can be a chemical that can be used in a product that can be used on hemp and marijuana. We also need to remember, though, that we have to read the fine print because in this case, the last line is it's exempt when used as a pesticide at 20 grams or less per acre. So it's just not enough to look at the headline. We have to read the fine print. There's other fine print that we need to pay attention to as well. So sulfur is exempt from the requirement of a tolerance, but application by burning or vaporization is not allowed because sulfur dioxide is not tolerance exempt. Also, sodium lauryl sulfate. It is only tolerance exempt when it is used as a fungicide or a miticide. So if you are planning to use it as an insecticide, it is not allowed. So now you're wondering, okay, Kelly, I've noticed that you've got 2 ingredients on your pesticide on your list that contain pipernyl butoxide and pyrethrins, and clearly the Code of Federal Regulations shows that there are tolerances established. It has tolerances for residues. Look, all these different crops, all these different parts per million. Why in the heck are they on your list? Well, the key is this little word here, post-harvest. So there are tolerances for post-harvest residues. That's, again, we have to pay attention to the fine print. The actual tolerance exemptions for these ingredients are found in CFR 180-905. So when applied to growing crops, petroleum oils, pipernyl butoxide, pyrethrins, and sabadilla are exempt from the requirements of a tolerance. All right, so now we've established that we've got some active ingredients that will make it on the list. Let's take a look at the rest of the label. Does the label allow use? Is the language unspecific enough to allow this product to be used on hemp or marijuana? So the devil weed is in the details. So I've got 2 products here. We've got Microtrol ESO and Botanigard Max. We've already established that pyrethrins are exempt from the requirements of a tolerance. So that first ingredient in Botanigard Max is exempt. So what about Bavaria bassiana? Well, we look it up and sure enough, yes, it does. It is exempt from the requirements of a tolerance. Great, good news. Both these products could make it on the list, but we've got one more thing we need to check. What about the label language? So the Microtrol ESO lists the specific herbs and spices it can be used on. However, the Botanigard Max has one little extra word in its list of herbs and spices, and that little extra word makes all the difference. The Microtrol ESO will not be on the list, but the Botanigard Max will be because of that single word, including. So what are some other words or phrases that we look for when we're evaluating these labels? We look for phrases like use on all flowering and foliage plants, vegetables and fruits. Words like including that you just saw, for use on all garden crops, for use on all food and feed crops, a phrase like such as, or my favorite, including but not limited to. So again, it is a lot of digging, a lot of interpreting, and making sure that that label is generic enough for us to add it to the list. So let's talk about that list. Here's a snip of a few of the ingredients on that list. So the hemp program, their WAC has a rule for voluntary certification for hemp intended for human consumption. And that rule provides that there will be a list of approved pesticides for use on, for that particular use available on the WSDA website. So we provide the hemp program with a list of pesticides that we have approved for use on hemp. This list is, we try to update it 2 to 3 times a year, try to keep it current. The list contains the brand name, the active ingredient, the percentage of that active ingredient, the EPA or Washington State registration number, along with the company that distributes that product. And there's also a couple other columns on the list. The one that I'd like to direct your attention to is the WPS yes or no. It's the second column over from the right. And that's a really important column for both the growers and retailers, people that are selling you these pesticides. And the reason is because if there's a yes or a Y in that column, it means that that label contains the agricultural use requirements box. And this box details the worker protection standards. So why is that important? Why would anybody care if we called out that that particular product has that box on the label? Well, retailers, in order to sell those products, they have to be licensed as a pesticide dealer, and they are required to keep records on the sales of those products. And commercial producers and growers, they are subject to worker protection standards. So their employees must be trained on the worker protection standard. So I know a lot of growers will take a look at that box and decide what kind of product that they want to purchase based on what kind of record keeping that they want to do in training for their employees. I'm going to kind of divert a little bit. I'm going to talk about the pesticide types that you might find on that hemp list. There's actually 2 types of pesticides that we list on that list. And you've probably heard me talk about FIFRA. FIFRA stands for the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. Again, that's a federal act. And within that act, there are different registration types, and 2 of them are a Section 3 and a Section 25B. So I kind of want to give you an idea what the difference is between those 2. So a FIFRA Section 3 pesticide, these are going to be your conventional pesticides. These must be evaluated and registered with EPA before we can register it in Washington State. It can take up to 2 years and cost nearly $800,000 to get one of these pesticides registered. Now that is in addition to all of the years of research and development of trying to come up with a new active ingredient or testing this product on different crops. So very labor intensive, time intensive, and money intensive. The other type of pesticide registration is FIFRA Section 25B minimum risk pesticide. And the clue here is in its name. It's considered a minimum risk to people, minimum risk to the environment. So it is regulated by EPA, but not registered by EPA. EPA regulates it by establishing the 6 conditions that these pesticides must meet in order to be considered minimum risk. And a couple of these conditions are the specific ingredients that can be used in the formulation of this pesticide. So these pesticides are considered a state-only registration. There's no federal review. Oftentimes, we are the very first to see these labels, and there's a lot of back and forth typically between us and the registrant to get these registered. So while it might not be as monetarily intensive, it's a lot of time intensiveness with these type of products within my own shop. So it takes a little time and a lot of back and forth. So jumping back to the hemp list, right now it contains 359 products. 262 Section 3 pesticides are on it. So you see that's a heck of a lot more than the 57, 58 pesticides that EPA has allowed right now. We also have 97 25B minimum risk pesticides on that list. So I wanted to mention that because now hemp is a regular crop, it is a regular agricultural commodity. But we're going to continue to follow this criteria and maintain this list of pesticide labels that specifically list hemp as a crop and those that include those unspecified crops just until the end of this year. We figured that this will give registrants the time to amend their Section 3 labels with EPA and amend their Section 25B labels with us to add hemp to their label. And then beginning in 2022, we will only maintain a list of pesticide labels that specifically list hemp on the label as the crop. All right, I just briefly want to touch on the other pesticides that are allowed for use on hemp, but we don't include them on the list. So these would be pesticides, pre-plant pesticides, maybe something to burn down a field to get rid of the grass and broadleaf weeds prior to planting. So this is allowed, any pre-plant pesticides, say that 4 times fast, that is allowed if the food crop to be planted following the application is not specified on the label. So, for instance, a herbicide label that says may be used to kill grass and broadleaf weeds prior to planting vegetables can be used before planting hemp. However, if it says may be used to kill grass and broadleaf weeds prior to planting corn, tomatoes, and onions, you can't use it on hemp. All the other label directions have to also be followed. Again, the label is the law. That's one thing that is always drilled into my head. The label is the law. We also allow post-harvest pesticides. They're not going to be on the list either. So these would be used in a facility where maybe hemp products are being processed. So they are limited to non-contact or indirect uses unless the active ingredient meets all of the conditions and the criteria. In other words, it is tolerance exempt. And that label is also labeled for post-harvest use. These pesticides must also be specifically labeled for the intended use, in other words, a food processing establishment. Other products on the list are spray adjuvants. Well, excuse me, not on the list, but allowed are spray adjuvants. Now we've got about, I'm going to say nearly 800 spray adjuvants registered in Washington State. Most of them can be used on food crops, but you could see that it would completely overwhelm the pesticide list if we put spray adjuvants on the list, the hemp list. So we leave them off and we just have a disclaimer that any spray adjuvant can be used as long as it can be used on food crops, and it must be used with the pesticide type that is allowed by the spray adjuvant label. So I've got a copy of a label here that is a herbicide, but it may only be used on, it may only be mixed with herbicides. So you cannot use this product with an insecticide or a fungicide. So again, Label is the law. You got to follow the label. And with that, I am finished my presentation, and I will entertain some questions. Let me get my slideshow off of here and get back to the screen. All right. Were there any questions?
So I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box. Does anyone have any questions for Kelle that they would like to put into the chat box? You must have given them all the information in the world, Kelle.
That's, yeah. I
That's
loaded
very
up
helpful.
a lot. All right, great.
Yes, good to front load.
Yes.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Kelle. That was super informative. So to everyone who we have here, I'm just going to take every in-between time to do my logistical announcements. So thanks to everybody who joined us. For anyone who might have been in a WebEx meeting, thanks for moving on over. We sent out the updated links through our listserv, but clearly not everyone got them. So just so everybody knows, we will not have any future webinars on WebEx. So check out the listserv for our Microsoft Teams links and our updated calendar invites. Also, if you're just not finding the information and you want to make sure that you attend our next 2 webinars, I have our email hemp@agr.wa.gov in the chat box. Just email me and I will send you the link for our future webinars. And now, with no further ado, I'm going to introduce our final presenter. And so we are lucky to have David Bryson here from our Pesticide Compliance Division. David, are you ready for us?
Yep, all set.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to David. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Can you see the presentation okay? Can you hear me okay?
Hi, David, this is Kelle. No, I don't. I can hear you, but I don't see your presentation.
Okay. Let's see. I'll try that again here. Okay, how about that?
No, I don't see it coming through yet.
Okay, try one more. Try to wake it up here. Did that succeed?
No, I'm still not seeing it.
Huh. Well, it worked yesterday. Okay.
David, if you want to, you could email it.
I think I got it.
Oh.
Oh, yeah.
Marked improvement.
Okay. Let's see.
It's a process.
Yeah. Had to get rid of all the things that popped up. Okay. Okay, can you see that okay?
Yeah, it's still your like PowerPoint view though. It's not necessarily
Okay.
like the slideshow view. I think you're on the, yes.
There we go.
Great,
Okay,
perfect.
sorry about that. Sometimes getting to the technology part is fun. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to pick up where Kelly left off a little bit and a little bit of duplication, but overall we'll have some new subjects on the matter of pesticides. I'm an agricultural chemical specialist with the Department of Pesticide Compliance out of Pesticide Management. And what I'd like to talk about today is pesticide regulations and a little bit on issues in industrial hemp. Some of us going to be lending from cannabis, what we've seen there, and things to consider. Okay, pesticide regulation in the United States is overseen by federal EPA, as most people know, overall on the federal level. The Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act authorizes EPA to register and regulate pesticides, and they authorize the states to do that. The other part of it is, Kelly already talked about tolerances and that hemp didn't really have the tolerances set at this point because it's such a new crop, even though it dates back to ancient time in the United States, it still hasn't been registered since FIFRA came to be so much. States have what we call primacy enforcement. In other words, EPA hands that over to the states to take responsibility for looking into pesticide use and misuse and taking care of any violations like we do with pesticide compliance. EPA reviews our program periodically and looks at some of the inspections we do, the investigations and such, to make sure we come up to a standard that they want us to actually be at. Okay, WSDA Pesticide Management Division, the compliance portion, and we have to take and codify basically laws from EPA, FIFRA, and put those into our own laws here in the state of Washington. And here are examples of the ones that we have here. The Washington State Pesticide Application Act, general pesticide rules under that, and the worker protection standard. And Kelly mentioned this, and this is a big deal here because this is a major enforcement issue, keeping the workers safe and protected from pesticides, and will continue to be so, more so in the future too. The Department of Labor and Industries enforces this too. They have their own WAC, and we try to keep them pretty much equal and as far as both the same and enforce it equally across the board. Other rules too be relating to chemigation. There's some other rules out there too, but they won't be as important to the hemp industry here. Okay, Washington State Code has to be at least as strict as the FIFRA. This is according to EPA, at least as strict as the FIFRA code, and may contain additional requirements too, which we do as far as having registration of adjuvants, having registration of 25B chemicals too. Okay, pesticide compliance, we have different offices. We basically broken into 4 areas, and investigators out of each of those areas, area managers, and we do a number of inspections per year. And any time we get a call in for an investigation, we take care of that too. A little bit more about investigations. Complaints come in, and we have to evaluate because we get all different types of complaints. We could be anywhere from somebody spraying their neighbors spraying their roses to all the way out to major drift onto workers, etc. So what happens then is we get a complaint, figure out that it's legit. We send out a compliance investigator to investigate the facts and determine what took place there. Okay, complaint origins. General public is a big area that they come out of. We've had growers make complaints too quite often. A lot of times there'd be drift onto their crops. We've had one case where there's a hemp crop that had a nearby application drift up on it. As far as hemp goes at this point, since it's a brand new crop, we haven't had all that many cases involving hemp. Farm workers also make complaints too, and that's going back to the worker protection standard too, and drift onto workers, not only within their own system as far as farming system, but oftentimes from adjacent farming systems. And federal and state agencies may call in complaints too. EPA may receive a complaint and send it over to us. Ecology is a source of our complaints, and Department of Health too, of course. Okay, as far as pesticides go, some of these you might be familiar with. There's a whole gamut of pesticides out there, and that's Kelle's realm pretty much as far as registration goes. But what is a pesticide? EPA definition is a pesticide is any substance or mixture of substances intended for preventing, destroying, repelling, and mitigating any pests, uses a plant regulator, defoliant, or desiccant, uses a nitrogen stabilizer. Going beyond that, the pesticide must first be registered with the EPA. There's a couple of exceptions to that Kelle already mentioned. That'd be the 25B, where it's just a broad, does it fall into the category or not that EPA accepts? And then the other area would be adjuvants, where we actually register those under Kelle's department there to have a registration number, and the 25B product's the same thing there. Okay, well, one way of looking some of this up is through the WSU Pesticide Information Center online, which is PICKLE for short. And this is going to be a little bit more helpful in after or into 2022 when more pesticides are listed there. And you aren't relying upon that list that Kelle mentioned previously about the accepted pesticides for use on hemp. This could be utilized in doing your pesticide use reports too and looking up 25B pesticides. I emphasize this because that's one of the areas on 25B pesticides and adjuvants both. The people forget to add the registration numbers because they aren't on the label. So you'll find those in the PICKLE database. You can look that up, find the WSDA registration number and add that to your pesticide use report. Okay, Kelle mentioned this too, and the label is the law, and you can't emphasize that enough. You got to read that label and make sure that you're interpreting it right and using the product properly. Okay, so what's on a pesticide label? PPE requirements, use patterns allowed, agricultural use requirement section, which most agricultural labels have. Kelle showed that and made it reference to that triggers the worker protection standard requirements. Okay, so this is what is considered a conventional pesticide that is registered as a sub-registration for hemp production. Supplemental label to exile label allowing use on hemp indoor, greenhouse, and outdoor. It's a conventional pesticide in that it's not one of the 25Bs or one of those widely accepted under that. It has an active ingredient of potassium laurate. Person making the pesticide application needs to have the Exile product label as well as a supplemental label that allows for use on hemp crop, and that's important. If we were doing an inspection, somebody stopped by from the department and you didn't have that label, you might be cited on that as a notice of correction. Or at least talked about it and told to have that. On this label, if you're looking at it, it has an agricultural use requirements box. Take a little bit closer look at that. And you can see a couple of different things on that. Do not allow worker entry into the treated area during the restricted entry interval REI of 12 hours. So what does that mean to you? Basically, it triggers a lot of different things, that REI requirement. It triggers that use box, basically triggers the worker standard itself. And EPA states that the purpose of the WPS is to reduce the risk of illness or injury to agricultural employees resulting from occupational exposure to pesticides in production agricultural plants and agricultural establishments. Okay, so it's also designed to protect other people from the risk of pesticides used in agricultural production. And other people would be persons adjacent to the crop you're spraying, people walking down the road, etc. Okay, in EPA worker protection standard, worker and handler is defined. And a worker is somebody that the employee that does hand labor tasks such as pruning, fixing, irrigation, moving plants, etc. Handler is defined as employee that performs any task related to applying, mixing, or loading pesticides. And a handler would also be somebody who cleans your respirators, moves irrigation equipment around after a application's made. They all have to fall under that too. Okay, what to look for in the pesticide label agricultural use requirements section. Sort of touched on that a little bit, the restricted entry interval, REI. And basically it tells you that this requirement tells you the time after the application is made before a person could enter into that area. And on this one, we already saw it, the REI of 12 hours. So 12 hours have to elapse after the application. Otherwise, if somebody has to go in before then, like let's say they have to move some irrigation equipment around, started irrigation or something like that. And at that point, you'd have to have the chemical protection, the coveralls, chemical resistant gloves, barrier laminate, and the shoes plus socks that you see underneath that REI and the PPE requirement. So it's just basically protect the worker there. Okay, if there's not an REI given in the agricultural use requirements section of the label, then it goes to a default of 4 hours. And basically that's just to allow the chemical that you sprayed on and the carrier to dry out before somebody gets in there. That way it won't get on them as easily. Okay, for early entry, we already discussed that a little bit. This is what was on this label. You see it down at the very bottom, PPE required for early entry. Okay, so more employer requirements. Let's see. Annually train and document training of pesticide handlers and workers. Okay, and these training records need to be kept by the employer for a period of 2 years on the establishment. So if a person from pesticide compliance came in and wanted to do an inspection of your records under WPS rule records, and they ask you for those records, you'd have to be able to produce those. You should have them right there on the establishment and say, these are my workers, these are how they've been trained, and you have those records available. Okay, so that ensures that your employees have received training specific to their potential exposure to pesticides. So every pesticide that you're going to be using in that establishment, you should train those people too. And that should be in the record too, and let you know on that. Okay, training on safety equipment fit and use. In other words, if you have to use respirators, goggles, gloves, and especially with the respirator, you got to do a respirator fit test, make sure everybody is medically cleared to be able to use a respirator, and keep all those records too. So a lot in the worker protection standard. We're going to cover just parts of it here and give you some references on how to learn more about it too on the WSDA site. Okay, training must be given in a language that the worker or handler can understand. And who could provide training for workers and handlers? Well, you could attend a WSDA train-the-trainer course, and then that person could train your workers. Or you could get a private applicator license. If you're already applying restricted use materials, there's going to be somebody or should be somebody within your establishment that has a private applicator license at that point. So that person can do the training of your workers and handlers both. Okay. The WPS training must comply with WPS requirements using EPA approved materials. And on the WSDA site, we have links to show you where the EPA materials are and how to obtain those too. Records of training must be kept for 2 years. And here's an example of a form you could use. You can make up your own just to be able to verify that the training took place, what you used as far as training materials go, who the trainer was, and date. Employee signature is important. That's the way they're testing that they actually received the training. And you need to annually train with the new WPS requirements. It was actually put in place in 2015 as far as the verbiage goes, but we're starting to enforce that now. Annually train and document training of pesticide handlers and workers both. Have a central location where WPS safety poster or equivalent is displayed. The central notification area is what we're going to call that. And that's going to be someplace where all your workers go by daily, basically. They're going to be able to see that. And there's several reasons there, but there's a number of things that should be in that central notification area. So you have display the WPS poster at mixed load sites, and I'm not sure how many mixed load sites you're going to have in different areas of a hemp establishment, but any place like you actually mix load and you have decontamination water and all that. And there's different requirements for that too. Here's a safety poster or an example of a safety poster that could be used. You note down towards the bottom, in an emergency, there's contact information that should be filled out for what's available close by to you. And as an employer, you're obligated to make sure that they have some type of transportation in the case of an emergency to get to medical help. Okay. Workers must be notified of pesticide applications at central location. So you'll have information there. Basically, it'll be on some type of form you can make up. I'll show you an example of one. Product name, EPA registration number for that product, active ingredient, crop site treated, location, description, dates, time of application, and the duration of the REI. This is going to help workers and handlers both. They could go up to that list, and this is going to be in your central notification area that they see daily. And they could figure out if they could go work in a certain area, or before they go work in a certain area, figure out if there's a REI still in place and if they could go in without having that PPE on, or if they would need to don the PPE before going into that area. Here's an example. See the posting. All your workers have to do is go and look at it, look at the area. You have to have a area designated so they know what that refers to, and they could look at that and see if they could go there. Okay, post the application information prior to making the application and keep it posted for 30 days after the REI has expired. And that's part of the WPS requirements. A safety data sheet should often be accessible and legible within the establishment itself. If one of your workers asks for a safety data sheet, you should be able to provide that to them. Safety data sheet is what we used to call the material safety data sheet. Okay. The SDS and the pesticide application information must be kept on record for 2 years and must be made available to workers, handlers, or their authorized representative when they ask for it. Okay, our state rule requires that SDS be retained for 7 years. It goes beyond what EPA requires on that. Posting of application areas. There's different posting requirements depending on a couple different things, and one of them is the REI length and duration. A greenhouse must be posted when the REI is greater than 4 hours, and a greenhouse includes any enclosed grow area too, which would be like a tube house or indoor grow like this, where they have clones starting. This would be considered in that greenhouse category too. So you'd have to post this also. Posting of outdoor grow, outdoor applications with REI greater than 48 hours must post warning signs. If REI is 48 hours or less, then either oral notification or posting can be done. Okay, as far as removing posting signs, this is something you see a lot of times, especially in orchards more so, but they'll have the posting sign up way after the application took place, more than 30 days after the REI, and it's out there as if using it for a trespassing sign. And these aren't to be used for a no trespassing sign. 3 days after the end of the application or any restricted entry interval, whichever is later, is when they should be removed or covered up. Okay, some of the resources that are available, and there's a lot of links if you go to these resources that are available too. If you go to Washington State Department of Agriculture pesticide compliance site or pesticide management division site and see that, you can look at a lot of the resources there. Okay, there's one resource out there that shows the differences between the Washington State and federal WPS requirements too. So make sure you know that. Elle and I will have some of these same requirements as we do. And this bulletin's available on our site too. Okay, like I mentioned before, there are more requirements than the worker protection standard. I'm not going to go over all of those today because that's almost a whole day information source in itself. Okay, pesticide use reporting says all WSDA certified applicators who apply pesticides and all persons applying pesticides to more than 1 acre of agricultural land in a calendar year, including public entities engaged in roadside spraying of pesticides, must keep records of their pesticide applications for 7 years. So that's our state code. And one of the things to keep in mind on this, you see that more than 1 acre of agricultural land in a calendar year. That's a little bit tricky because the definition of that and the interpretation of that by the WSDA here is that that could be cumulative. So let's say you start out your clones inside and you make maybe 10 applications to the clones inside, then move them outside, and maybe you only make 1 or 2 applications outside. That whole accumulation of applications as far as area goes of the clones inside for each application, you got to add that together. And the outside application summation of area, if that goes over an acre, then you got to keep records. So your best thing to do is keep records anyway. It works out better. And plus you have information on what you actually did. Pesticide application record. All pesticides used as part of an application or take mix should be included in the application record. Registration numbers could be found on the label of products used for EPA registered pesticides, and we already went over the adjuvants in the 25B where you can find those registration numbers. Okay, WSDA Internet site has copies of record forms that could be used. And there's 3 forms, 1, 2, and 3 are the most frequently used to document pesticide application in agricultural crops. Okay, another area that we look at and consider is pesticide storage requirements. This would be when we're doing an inspection. Any type of danger, warning, or caution label of a pesticide should be in a secured storage out of reach of children. That's the most critical one. The danger poison label should be in a very secured storage, locked, prevent children and unauthorized persons. So this would be the very highly critical one as far as you got to keep those really safe out of reach of people and also placard your outside of your building. Here's a placard that you could use on the outside of the building. It should be on all sides. In other words, if the fire department were approaching this in some type of emergency like a fire, they would know that this has a problem inside as far as maybe fuming off danger poison type chemicals. Okay, as far as your storage area goes too, good housekeeping is looked at. Seen a lot of storage areas where they have the caps off of containers or spills, empty containers on the side leaking a little bit of just whatever is left in the container. But this storage area here is perfect. This is probably one of the best ones I've ever seen, so I use it as an example here. Okay, so I was going to go over a few unique considerations to the Washington State hemp market. And you see on this sign, they have industrial hemp on the sign and all that, all the requirements. CBD from hemp. And this is bridging over in some means to the cannabis market too. Extraction of chemical to achieve concentrated product. Whenever you do that, It could also concentrate your pesticides. And we found that really to be true in the cannabis with chemicals such as butoxide. It could really increase the amount, especially if you spray late in the budding area or the flowering time. LCB requires testing of CBD before it can be used in processing a product to be sold in cannabis retail stores. Okay, so that's probably not such as big of a problem when it's going to other types of uses, but it's really going to be looked at closely for that. Anytime there's chemical within that, it's always going to be a problem if it goes above tolerance levels, of course, and sooner or later we're going to have those. Keep in mind that certain pesticides may have a tendency to sequester the buds and flowers more with all the oils, and it could create a problem there. Spraying late stages can result in higher concentrations. Okay, I sort of breezed through that a little bit as far as some of the WPS goes, but keep in mind that that's a requirement whenever you use a chemical with those requirements on an agricultural use box is a key indicator that it triggers the WPS requirements. Are there any questions at this point?
Yeah, so I see one question, which is, can you share and talk about the PERC, P-E-R-C website?
Okay, I don't have the actual link to it, but the link is on the WSDA site. And the PERC site goes into WPS requirements in detail. And they have some good information there that you could reference. Okay. Any other questions?
Any other questions? All right, it doesn't look like we have any questions at this point. So I want to thank everyone for attending our webinar. Just a few closing notes that all future webinars will be on Microsoft Teams. So I did just go in and delete all of our future WebEx links so that that confusion does not reoccur. I will be sending out the Microsoft Teams link for next week and then the week following. If you are not on our listserv, I encourage you to join our listserv. Otherwise, email hemp@agr.wa.gov to get the links for our next two webinars. Next week, we'll be focused on nursery requirements, phytosanitary certificates, pest quarantines. So it should be another interesting webinar. So be sure to join us next Wednesday, I believe from 10 to 12. And we'll be posting these webinars. There will be a little delay because we have to close caption them before we make them available to the public. So we'll be working on that, and then these will be available on our website. So thanks for all of your patience today and getting into the right link. And it was great to connect with you all. Thanks so much.